Hey everybody, Doug Knoll here, and in this Facebook Live event, I want to talk about verbal aggression and to give you some strategies for dealing with the bullies and the jerks that you have to deal with at work. This is really a deep topic, and I am only really going to kind of skip over the waves to give you an insight as to what's going on and what you can do if you have to confront bosses or colleagues or customers or people who are just verbally aggressive, rude, and insulting. And hopefully it'll give you some ideas about how to go about dealing with those people, maybe even next week. So let's get started. As always, if there are comments that you want to make, I will try to monitor from my end the comments that you put up there and try to answer questions as they come up. And if I miss you and it's an important question, you can always email me at doug@dougknoll.com and I will get right back to you. All right, so let's get started. Let's see here. I got to make this thing work, don't I? Here we go. All right, and I'm going to shrink me down out of here because I'm not important in this discussion. So we're going to be talking about verbal aggression. And the first thing that we need to do is get some definitions of what we're talking about. So the way I define verbal aggression is it's an attempted execution of social power. There's also physical aggression, which is a different kind of aggression, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But here's the thing that's really interesting. You may or may not know that I'm a secondary black belt and have studied the martial arts for many years, and I'm also a Tai Chi master. And just as I have been trained to respond to physical aggression, we all can be trained in the same essential way as in martial arts training to respond to verbal aggression. If you don't train for it, if you don't practice techniques and skills and ideas, then every time somebody yells at you or insults you or disrespects you or otherwise is verbally aggressive, you're going to be like a person who's being held up with no skills to defend yourself. So learning how to deal with verbal aggression is in large part, of course, understanding the dynamics of what's going on, which is what this talk is going to be all about, but also taking the time to prepare yourself to train to deal with verbal aggression. And that is really, just like martial arts training, learning how to deal with these kinds of insults and misbehaviors at work is something that we must practice and train for in order to be effective at it. Verbal aggression always contains a message that attacks you if you're the listener, the victim. And the idea here is that a person becomes verbally aggressive with the intent of delivering a psychological pain. That is the intent. Now, the intention may be unconscious because the verbal aggression may be unconscious. It may just be a reactive behavior to something, to a trigger that the speaker encountered, or it might be intentional, where you've got a person who's being verbally aggressive for the intent, with the conscious thought of causing pain to you, of insulting and disrespecting you. So either way, whether it's unconscious or conscious, the hallmark of a verbally aggressive statement is that it is an attack on you with the idea of making you feel pain. And the kinds of behaviors that we have all seen with verbal aggression include a loud voice, pointing, maybe getting your finger right in your face, moving into your personal space where they're crowding and pushing you and making you move or get out of it, create more social space. And you can probably list a whole bunch of other behaviors that you would see with verbal aggression. As in physical aggression, what you want to start paying attention to and start thinking about and maybe even writing down and listing are when you are encountering verbally aggressive people in your organization, list out the behaviors that are associated with that verbally aggressive behavior so that you can begin, instead of being startled by it, you can begin to see it coming, you can predict it, and that will give you ways of defending yourself appropriately. If you do not take the time to study verbally aggressive behavior and start isolating For example, what kind of eye contact, what kind of loud voice, what kind of verbiage is being used? Is there movement into personal space or not? What are the other behaviors that you might be seeing? If you're not paying attention to that, then more likely than not, every time somebody is verbally aggressive with you, you're going to get bushwhacked. So paying attention to all of this stuff from now on is really important. The other thing about verbal aggression is that it intends to communicate how worthless you are as a listener. And we're going to go deep into this because this is all about power and discursive positioning, which once you understand what discursive positioning is and understand what power is all about, you'll be able to defend against this discursive position that you're a worthless person and I am superior to you, and so forth and so on. So the kind of behaviors that we see with this idea of worthlessness, where you are being attacked, is, of course, insults, disrespect, taunting, ridiculing, demeaning. It could be stereotyping. It could be cussing you out. I mean, it could be all kinds of different behaviors. And again, what you want to do is start making an inventory of the kinds of behaviors that you see when somebody is verbally aggressive and how they are going about making you or somebody else feel worthless and less than themselves. And the fundamental question that you have to answer for yourself every time you are subjected to verbal aggression is simply this. Do you choose to accept the narrative offered by the aggressor? And most of the time, listeners or victims of verbal aggression they make a choice to believe or accept the narrative. And the reason for that is because of social conditioning. But here's the great news. I'm giving you permission right now to reject that narrative. You can reject that narrative totally out of hand. And the moment you reject that narrative and say, this is bullshit, the aggression goes away. It will no longer have an effect on you. Now, you may not be able to say this is bullshit to the person who's aggressing you, but once you decline the narrative offered by the aggressor in your head, your position vis-a-vis that aggressive person completely changes, and now you're in a place of power. And I'll kind of explain how this all works as we go along. But the key here is to not fall into the trap of accepting the narrative offered by the aggressor. And let me take a minute or two and explain why people fall into this trap. Our First of all, as human beings, we're hierarchical. And we've learned hierarchy, social hierarchy, from the time we were little babies. And in our families of origin, the hierarchy was mom and dad, if you had a mom and dad, or caregiver was in charge, and you were the person with no power, very little power. And we learn very quickly as we're socialized that he or she who has the most power wins. When we go to school, there's hierarchy. There are teachers and principals, and then we start doing teams, and there are team captains and different positions on sports teams, and we just learn how to navigate all these hierarchies, and we learn how to position ourselves within these hierarchies to fit in, to be accepted, and to fit in to not cause problems. But the problem with that is that we become conditioned to the idea that the person who appears to be in charge, the person who has higher status in the hierarchy, has the right to offer a narrative that we must accept. And that is false. That is absolutely false. And so people who are verbally aggressive somehow intuitively know that they can take advantage of a hierarchy or of a power structure, and that the listener generally is going to accept the narrative. And what I'm telling you is you do not have to accept that narrative. In fact, you should never accept that narrative. And when you learn how to reject the narrative, things change. So let's talk about power for a few minutes, because power and verbal aggression and with physical aggression are linked together. Power is the ability of a person to determine whether or not another party is going to be able to achieve his or her goals. So if one person has power over another person, the person who holds the power can either advance or thwart the ability of the less powerful person to satisfy his or her needs over and above the second party's own efforts. And that is fundamentally what social power is all about. There are many, many sources of power, and this becomes important. I'm going to go slowly on this slide, and if you're taking notes, this is a good place to take notes. And you can, of course, always go back and rewatch this if you didn't catch it all. But the reason that sources of power become important is because part of what you will be doing when you are confronted by a verbally aggressive person is you're going to have to do a down and dirty power assessment and think about what is the power that this person has in the moment, and is that power relevant power or not. So just understanding where power is coming from is really, really an important tool to have when you're dealing with verbally aggressive people. So of course we have physical force. I'm a big guy, and I can dominate people pretty easily physically. In my prime, many, many years ago, a fair fight for me was 5 guys with knives and me unarmed. That's not true anymore, but when I was at the peak of my martial arts training, that was an even fair fight for me. So physical force becomes important as a source of power. And obviously most men are larger than most women, and so one of the reasons why we have issues around domestic violence and relationship violence and that sort of thing is because men are naturally stronger than women in many cases and are able to use physical force to dictate what they want. Threats and promises. We're going to talk more about threats and promises in a moment, but these are sources of power. And we'll just sideline this for a second and come back to it in more detail, because most verbal aggression involves some kind of threat or implied promise. Information control is a source of power. If you are in an organization and you have information that other people don't have, that may give you power over them, because if they don't have the correct information, maybe they can't make the right decisions or the best decisions, and so that's a form of power. One of the things that I teach in leadership is that when you are planning meetings, it's critical that if you're the person running the meeting, you're the person that drafts the agenda, because setting the agenda is a form of information control. And just as an aside, never, ever, ever go into a meeting without there being an agenda, because otherwise you risk the possibility of being manipulated by somebody who has more information. So, and if you go into a meeting and there is no agenda, the very first thing you should do, no matter who's leading the meeting, is say, could we please agree on an agenda, what this meeting is about and what the outcome is going to be. And that way you can forestall, in many cases, manipulation by lack of information. You can also have special skills and abilities as a source of power. So obviously a physician has the ability to diagnose, and perhaps if the physician is a surgeon, to operate on people. And we can think of many, many examples of where people have special skills and abilities that give them a source of power, that if they withhold those skills and abilities, it could thwart the ability of the victim, for example, from obtaining his or her needs. We also have, in addition to special skills and abilities, there's expertise. It's a slightly different. Expertise is cognitive knowledge. Special skills and abilities might be cognitive, but it might also be based on just a lot of practice and a lot of skills. And so having expertise about the task, being able to understand it, understand the theories about what's going on, is a source of power. Personal attractiveness and likability, we can call this charisma. It's a very powerful source of power, as we all know. Control over rewards and punishments. So if somebody can reward you by giving you a bonus or giving you a paycheck, that is a form of power. If they can punish you by firing you, that is a form of power. Moral standing is a source of power that Gandhi used to great effect in the 1920s and 1930s in his Satyagraha movement to get rid of the British Empire and have them quit India. And he did it successfully. Legal standing is a source of power. Legitimacy and recognition. So, for example, if a corporation board of directors selects a CEO as the leader of the company, that is considered a legitimate source of power. The CEO has been granted power by the board of directors to make decisions and to lead the organization. A person elected to Congress, for example, in a obviously fair, open election, has legitimacy as the representative of that congressional district. And so that is a source of power. External support can be a source of power. So if you can imagine being in a situation where there are other people outside of maybe your immediate group or team and they are supporting you, then you have got a power base that other people might not have. So you might have a power base up the hierarchy unrelated to your particular flow, but that could be a source of power for you. It could be a source of power for somebody else too, where they have external support that protects them in a political environment. A formal position in a group can be a source of power. So if you're chairing a meeting, that would be a formal position in a group. If you are an officer of a corporation, that could be a formal position in a group. If you have a management role that has a formal job title, then that would be a source of power. You can have loyal allies as a source of power, and these are people who can come to your aid and help you and advise you and provide you moral and physical support if you need it. You can have persuasive skills, which is a source of power, and so persuasion is extremely powerful when used properly. You can have control over critical group possessions and resources. I can't tell you how many times I've been involved in mediating conflicts where a decision was made at the highest part of a company but required a purchasing agent to execute his or her job by acquiring certain materials, and the purchasing agent didn't like the CEO or the president and slowed down the process, causing the whole project to tank and really causing great harm to the company. And the purchasing agent was able to passive-aggressively deflect this. That purchasing agent had a lot of power. And so when you have control over critical group possessions and group resources, even if you're very low in the hierarchy, you still have a lot of power. Hierarchy and power are unrelated in many ways. Don't think that because you're at the top of the company that you have all the power. And don't think that because you're at the bottom of the rung that you don't have any power. Power and hierarchy are, in some ways they can be related, but in many ways they are not related. And of course, other resource control. So let's go back and talk about threat. Threat is a state that in which you, if you're the person being threatened, feels inadequate to deal with a given situation. In other words, the threat that is being delivered to you makes you feel like, I can't deal with this situation in this moment, and I can't satisfy my own needs because there's a person out there who is threatening to block me, stop me, thwart my efforts to satisfy my own needs. That is essentially what a threat is. So when you're dealing with verbal aggression, oftentimes you'll be dealing with threats, and oftentimes you will be dealing with apparent power imbalance, power differentials. And so thinking about how to respond to verbal aggression and what you're going to do in the future, and thinking about that martial arts training, mental martial arts training you need to go through yourself to figure out what to do with that aggressive boss or that aggressive customer or that aggressive superior who's just a complete jerk, requires you to do some serious thinking and some planning. The first thing you really want to identify is who's got the high power and who's got the low power. And we'll come back and talk about this analytical little problem in a moment. And it's not always what you think it is. You would be amazed at how things shift when you do a full power analysis in a relationship. Obviously, if you haven't done this preparation before you are subjected to verbal aggression, you're not going to have any tools to work with. So this requires a lot of thinking ahead of time. And what I tell people is, if you've been subjected to verbal abuse in your workplace or in your organization once, it's going to happen again, and you might as well take the time to learn how to deal with it and really think through how you're going to manage the next time somebody is aggressive with you. It also, of course, involves self-esteem and status. If you have low self-esteem and you buy into the narrative of the verbally aggressive person that you are worthless, you're not going to have a lot of psychological resource to draw upon to be able to stand into that aggression and deny the narrative, reject the narrative. So your self-esteem becomes really critical in dealing with aggression. Also, status is important. You may be a mailroom clerk, for example, and the CEO is screaming at you because you didn't get a piece of mail to him in an appropriate moment, even though it wasn't your fault. Some people will think that just because their victim is lower status, it gives them the right to be aggressive. Not true, but you need to be thinking about that. What are the status positions here? In order for aggression to be effective, there has to be some kind of reward and punishment system. In other words, the aggressor has to have some ability to punish you or reward you to induce you to bend to his or her will. It also requires you, if you're the victim, to accept the social system that you've been placed in, that the verbally aggressive person is basically implying exists. If you don't accept the social system that's being offered by the aggressor, then the aggressor has no power over you. If the aggressor thinks that he or she has an important reward or punishment with you, then that may provide power. But if what that person has is not important to you, and you render it unimportant to yourself, then there's no more power. And that's how you get rid of power imbalance, really, is you look at what they are offering you, you look at what punishment they can dish out to you, and you decide how important that is to you. Now, it may be that you say, well, I really can't afford to get fired because I've got to get a job. But if you really did a thorough analysis of that situation, you might find that the threat of being fired is really ephemeral, that you do have a lot of power because you have special skills, knowledge, expertise, experience. I mean, go back to the power list and look at all those different things and think about all the different things you've got on that list that would allow you to go out and get a different job if you wanted to. And most people think they're locked into where they are, but they aren't. And that is social conditioning. And if you can break that social conditioning, then you can also break the stranglehold of power that people, especially verbally aggressive people, think they have on you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about assessing power. Here are 3 questions that I ask that I think are really useful. The first is, when you're thinking about a person who might be verbally aggressive with you or has been aggressive with you in the past and you can anticipate it coming in the future, think about the relative power positions of each party. So what you would want to do is identify the primary resources of the high-powered party. This would be the person who's verbally aggressive. Go back to that list of sources of power and identify what you think their sources of power really might be. And you might be surprised at how little is there. And there might be a lot, but oftentimes it's not nearly as much as the aggressive person thinks there is. And here's the other thing that's really important. Assuming you're the low-powered party, what are your primary resources? Go back to that list and identify all of the powers that you have and think about how you can bring them to bear when you're being victimized by a verbally aggressive person. You would be amazed at how much power you have if you start thinking about it in these terms. So once you've identified the primary resources of the aggressor and your primary power bases, then you can sort of sort out the relative power positions of each party, and you can start thinking about how is the power that this person has, is that power important to me? What do they have? What are they thwarting, or what are they able to thwart that I need? And do I have alternatives other than through this person to get my needs met? And is this really all that important, or am I just getting sucked into a social narrative that turns out to be fundamentally false? And you will find that most of the time the answer to the question is yes. You are getting sucked in unconsciously to a social contract that you made with society many years ago that just is not relevant to this moment right now, and you're being taken advantage of. And then once you recognize that, you can move away from it and you can diffuse the aggression quite quickly. So the evaluation of power imbalances requires, again, several questions to be asked. One is, what are the effects of power? In other words, when you see this verbally aggressive person exercising power in the form of aggression, what are the effects of it? How is this power being manifested? Is it because this person feels entitled, or because this person's status gives him or her the apparent right to scream and yell at you or to be verbally aggressive? What's the effect of power? If this person is a co-equal with you and is just a bully, does this person have allies? Does this person and are those allies supporting, or does this person have support, external support? How is the power manifesting itself? And you'll want to, after you practice this for a while, you'll be able to do this on the fly, and you'll be able to understand the effects of power, and you'll see it in motion, and it will give you lots of ideas for interventions. Who's acting most conservatively? So smart people with a lot of power rarely exercise their power. And I am always cautious of those people when I'm mediating a case, or I'm working in conflict, or I'm coaching, or I'm helping people become better leaders, whatever I happen to be doing. When I'm in a group and I see somebody who obviously has a lot of power, and they're being quiet and they're being conservative, that's when my radar goes up, because the smart people with a lot of power are always going to conserve their power, because they recognize that the exercise of power is costly and expensive. And so they will exude power, but they will never use it, and they will never threaten to use it, except in the most extreme cases. So when you're dealing with verbally aggressive people, you are probably dealing with somebody who is not acting conservatively and probably doesn't have as much power as he or she thinks he does, and is just trying to scare you or intimidate you into acting in a certain particular way. Be wary of those who are conservative. Those who are not so conservative and kind of yell and scream a lot, they really aren't as bad as dangerous to you as they might seem in the beginning. And then look at the power tactics that are being manifested. So you can go back and look at, are there threats? Is there reward? Is there punishment? Are they, verbally aggressive behavior? Are they belittling? They're trying to assert higher status over you, trying to make you feel worthless, trying to make you feel like you are lucky to have a job. Maybe they're expressing entitlement. All of those things. And you can just start analyzing their behaviors from a power tactics perspective, and the veil will be lifted from your eyes as you start to see what's going on. It's really quite remarkable when you see it. And as you practice this and start to see how people are really behaving, the man behind the curtain with the Wizard of Oz, you'll get a lot calmer, because the chaos that you're seeing will go away, because it's very predictable. So some of the power tactics that you will commonly see are threats and promises. We've talked about those. Issue control. We've talked about that, setting agendas. And power denial. And often, this is a weird one. This is where one person will deny you your own power in order to increase that person's power. And sometimes you'll see in verbal aggression, you'll see a denial of power. So it could be something like, how dare you do that without talking to me? Or who the hell do you think you are when and they start insulting you about decision-making you've made or an outcome that has occurred that they're not happy with. And basically what they are doing is denying you power. And that is a common power tactic. So when that kind of insulting, disrespectful outburst is occurring, you can be thinking to yourself, this person is trying to take away my power. And I'm not going to let that happen. So the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit more of a skill and a mindset. There are many different down on the dirt tactics you can use with verbally aggressive people, but without this higher theoretical understanding, those tactics generally don't work. But I want to talk about discursive positioning at kind of a theoretical level, and this one we will get tactical, because this is probably the most powerful way to deal with, one of the most powerful ways to deal with verbally aggressive people. So, we, as human beings, communicate with each other through words and a bunch of other things too. But let's just say we have utterances, and these are sounds that we have commonly agreed to have symbolic meaning. They represent things. They represent ideas. They can be abstract or they can be concrete. But we have, over the 250,000 years since hominids started speaking and language and communication was developed some rules. And one of the things we have evolved is that each utterance, each time somebody speaks, that talking structures a social relationship between the speaker and the listener. And this happens all the time, every single day. And when you start paying attention to this, it'll be like, wow, this is amazing how we unconsciously structure our relationships with each other simply by how we talk to each other. And the social relationship is incredibly dynamic. It's changing all the time. And we're constantly balancing self-esteem and face-saving and the esteem of other people, the person we're talking to and groups we're in. I mean, there's just a constant balance that our brains are working through as we go through this process we call speaking and communication. Each utterance also sets up relative speaking rights. We learned very early on as children not to interrupt. And so when we are speaking, we do not expect to be interrupted, and we also expect that the person who is listening will not start talking until we have finished speaking. And this is basically what I mean by setting up relative speaking rights. We learn from a very early age that we have to take turns when we're speaking. And the right to speak is basically earned, it's created by turn taking. You speak first, now it's my turn to speak. And you can think of many arguments you've been in where, are you done? Can I talk now? And that's the relative speaking rights that we have. Utterances, like a sentence or a paragraph or any verbal communication, also legitimates topics of conversation. If we accept the premise of the utterance that the speaker has uttered, then that becomes a legitimate topic of conversation. I can tell you some I won't bother telling you humorous stories of where I've tested this out in various groups that I've worked with over the years in teaching, but it's pretty funny how you can take something that's taboo in the group, and by simply asking the question, okay, what are all the things we can't talk about today? And you write them up on the board, you all of a sudden have just legitimated those for topics of conversation. And sure enough, sooner or later, people start talking about it. It's pretty crazy. So utterances have the power to legitimate topics of conversation, even topics that might otherwise be taboo or forbidden. There is also an implicit moral evaluation of possible meanings. So whenever somebody is uttering something, most of the time we're not particularly clear in what we say, and there's a moral evaluation going on about rightness and wrongness and just and fairness and unfairness and that sort of thing. Goodness, rightness. And this whole process is called discursive positioning. And basically what's happening is there's a negotiation going on between you and the other person in every conversation, and all kinds of things are being negotiated back and forth. And it happens on the fly, outside of our consciousness. We're not even aware that it's going on. But it's what we've learned to do and how we've learned to navigate communication since the time we started to speak, when we were 16, 17, 18 months old. And as we move through childhood and into adolescence and adulthood, our discursive positioning becomes more and more subtle, but it also becomes more unconscious, and we're not even aware that we're doing it. So as we think about discursive positioning and utterances, the primary motivation of discursive positioning is that people are seeking favorable relational positions for themselves. Now, this favorable relationships can mean all kinds of things. I mean, it could mean that I want my wife to love me. It could mean that I want to impress somebody. It could mean that this person is trying to impress me. Maybe one of my graduate students is trying to impress me. So it's these favorable relational positions can be obvious like that, but they can also be subtle and occur all the time. This positioning occurs all the time. So when you think about the verbally aggressive person, what is that person trying to do? In discursive positioning, that verbal aggressive person is trying to assert a favorable position for himself or herself over you. And so they're trying to establish a discursive position of moral authority over you. And the crazy thing is you don't have to accept that position. So, as I say here, from this position, they're going to claim entitlement. I'm morally superior to you, therefore I have the right to insult, belittle, and disrespect, and taunt and ridicule you because I'm a better person than you are, and you are worthless. But that's a claim of entitlement. That does not mean they are entitled. And the question that you have to ask is whether or not you want to accept that. Essentially, what's happening in discursive positioning is the verbally aggressive person is offering you a position from which to respond. They're calling you with the insults. They're calling you into a position of, I'm insulting you, I'm disrespecting you, and I think you are not worth anything. You're worthless. And that's the position that I'm putting you into, a worthless human being who has totally angered me and is not worthy of breathing the same air that I'm breathing. That's the discursive position that the verbally aggressive person is offering, but it's just an offer, and you can reject it. And as we know, the calling is usually to a less privileged position, as I just said. The beauty of all of this is you do not have to accept that discursive position. Here's a classic one. This is not necessarily verbally aggressive, but you've heard this many times. Look, I'm just trying to be reasonable here. That is an offer that says, I'm reasonable, you're unreasonable, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm going to win, you're going to lose, I'm morally superior to you, because only reasonable people can be morally superior, and you're being unreasonable because I'm trying to be reasonable and you're not. So think of all of the offers that are implicit in this simple little statement. And when you hear something like this, your radar has to go up and say, wait a minute, I'm being offered a discursive position that I may not want to accept. And just so while we're on the point, the way you respond to this is not to accept the position. You say, well, it's really not about reasonableness. It's about following the rules. Or it's really not about whether you or I are reasonable. What's really important is whether or not we can get the outcome that we need for our client. Or, well, that's really interesting that you're trying to be reasonable, but I don't see where reason has anything to do with this. We have a job to do, and this is what it is. Now, notice in that response, I changed the discursive position. I rejected the position being offered, and I redirected, or I reframed my utterance to offer a different discourse, a different discursive position. And that's the secret to dealing with verbally aggressive people. So you're not going to be able to change a discourse. In other words, you're not going to be able to stop a verbally aggressive person from being verbally aggressive. But what you can do is change your discursive position. And when you do that, it's like in Tai Chi. And if you've taken my masterclass webinar, if you haven't, be sure to take it, because I talk about Tai Chi in there, and I talk about the paradoxes of Tai Chi, where the softer you are, the stronger you are, the more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are. And so when you can change the discursive position by rejecting the implicit position being offered by the verbally aggressive person, you are in essence being a Tai Chi master. You are being soft and vulnerable, but you are strong and powerful. And that is an amazing place to be. And you will see amazing things happen around you when you learn how to take that position. So some of the questions that you can ask yourself, again, I've got a lot up here because I want to give you as much as I can, but But as you're thinking about dealing with verbal aggression in the workplace, and you're thinking about discursive positioning and how do I go about repositioning this, what can I say or what can I think about that will allow me to change my discursive position vis-a-vis what's being offered to me? So the first thing to do is what calls are being offered. So when you think about people who are verbally aggressive with you, whether they're being bullies or whatever, what are they offering you? What position are they putting you into? And of course, it's going to be a position of less entitlement, of humiliation, of being worthless. But let's be explicit about it. This is what they are trying to do. This is the position they're offering. And I have to make a choice about whether or not I want to accept that position or not. How are these positions being taken up or refused? Now, you can watch how these verbally aggressive people work with other people and watch how your colleagues deal with this. Do they accept it? Do they appease? Do they run away? Do they get defensive? In every single one of those circumstances, they are accepting the discursive position. They're not refusing it. And how many people do you see refusing the discursive position by offering up another discursive position? And you'll see that very rarely happening. What discursive assumptions must be present? So what is this verbally aggressive person assuming in the moment, and what are you assuming in the moment that makes this person think that he is entitled or she is entitled to be aggressive with you? And what positions do the parties seek to establish for themselves? This is where your preparation comes in. You know where the verbally aggressive person is coming from. Now, what position do you want to establish for yourself? And then you can start role-playing and writing out and practicing responses to the verbally aggressive person that repositions who you are vis-a-vis the aggressor. And it's different for every person, and it's always contextual, so it's difficult for me in the moment to give you examples of how that might be. But if you think about it and you really absorb what I'm saying here, and you think about the last time somebody was verbally aggressive with you, you can think about what position was I offered, what position do I want to be in? And then from that position, you can craft utterances that you'll have at the ready that will allow you to change the position. What options are made available or excluded in the issued position calls? So one of the things that you want to do when you are changing the discursive position is you may want to provide other options to the verbally aggressive person. You may want to lead them into another discourse based upon the options that you can create. You will not want to accept the limited options that the verbally aggressive person is giving you, but you may want to, as a strategy, open up options and provide other options. And you would do it very matter-of-factly. You would not necessarily ask questions. You would just make statements saying, well, you're very angry, and so this is what I'm going to do. And you just make declarative statements. And there's nothing they can do about that, as long as the options you're offering are appropriate under the circumstance. What alternative narratives can be opened or closed by the positions that are taking? So if the verbally aggressive person is closing down alternative narratives, what alternative narratives are being closed down? How about this? The verbally aggressive person is being that way because she just got chewed out by her boss, and she's super angry, and so she's angry, and she doesn't know how to control her anger, and has very low emotional intelligence, and has very low empathic abilities, and is just going to fly off the handle at the first person she sees, what happens to be you. And it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. This person just flew off the handle at you. All right. So how can you open up an alternative narrative there? Yes, you can. I mean, you can maybe explore by, first of all, de-escalating and then exploring what is causing the upset. And if you de-escalate properly by affective and cognitive empathy, which I teach, then they calm down quickly, as the brain studies show, and then you're able to engage in a little bit of problem solving, and you can open up alternative narratives. And it's really quite powerful when you do this. Obviously, power relations, you go back and do a power analysis, and what shifts in position are being enabled or disabled with the conversation. So you think about where, it's like a chess game. Where is this verbally aggressive person trying to move you? Where can you move them? And just be thinking along those lines. And then you start crafting out responses to various types of verbal aggression. So you think about, okay, in the last month I've had five situations where my boss or this person has just lit off on me, been really aggressive with me. What were the circumstances under each one? And now how can I respond? How can I discursively position myself so that I do not have to accept this verbal aggression, and I can take a different position that is it's not insubordinate, it's not rude, it's not being disrespectful, but it is a completely different position than what is being called for in the position that the aggressive person is taking. And just start writing out your responses, and then start trying them out, see what happens. This is systems of knowledge. Again, it goes back to power analysis and that sort of thing. So this whole idea of discursive positioning and dealing with verbally aggressive people is really powerful. And it does take some preparation. It takes some thinking. You have to think out ahead and kind of role play out in your head or in writing how it is that you're going to respond the next time that somebody is offering you a position of worthlessness and insult and taunting and ridicule. But you can do so from a place of respect and from a place of strength without being beat up. If you understand that all you're trying to do, all you're doing really is offering up a different discursive position. And at the end of the day, you can always say no. You can say that tone of voice is inappropriate. I'm not going to listen to this anymore, and leave. And just say, when your emotions are under control and you're willing to have a civil conversation with me, then I will listen to you. But you are not entitled to yell at me, to insult me, to taunt me, or ridicule me. You are not entitled to do that. I don't care who you are. And I'm leaving, and when you calm down, you can come talk to me, and I will be more than willing to work with you to solve whatever problem you might have right now. And leave at the end of the day. Now think about the discursive positioning that's going on in that statement, and where you are now asserting, I am not buying into this worthlessness stuff. You are not acting appropriately. And I am taking the moral high road here because you are acting immorally by being verbally aggressive. And I am willing to continue our relationship when you are willing to meet me on my terms. It takes a little courage to do that. But the alternative is to be a victim. And why? We don't have to do that. So anyways, that's my thinking on, at least right now, on the stuff around verbal aggression. I could spend hours talking about this and working with, all kinds of tools and tactics. But what I really wanted to do on this Facebook Live is sort of get people thinking about this and thinking about how they could use some of these ideas in preparing themselves, as I did as a martial artist, for physical aggression. You do the same thing with verbal aggression. These are the tools, and start thinking about them and using them and practicing them, and I think you're going to see some really cool things happen. So anybody, I got a couple of people on the line here. Anybody who's live, if you've got any questions, go ahead and type them in, and I will see what I can do about answering them. And of course, you can always email me at doug@dougnoll.com, and I'm happy to answer emails. Okay, well, doesn't look like there are any questions. Good. I hope I was clear enough for everybody. One last thing, to the degree that you want a free strategy session call to talk about any of this stuff, if you haven't had a call with me yet about what's going on in terms of anger and insult in your organization and how it's affecting your life, I do these free calls, and in those calls, I spend a lot of time listening to you and giving you perfect clarity about the severity of the problem and your options. And in a few cases, if you agree and I agree, then I take you on as a student, and you can become a master student with me. And it's totally up to both of us whether or not we both think it's right. But if you're interested in that call, then you can go to dougnoll.com, apply. That link should work, and just schedule an appointment with me for a telephone, Zoom, or Skype conference, and it'll be fun talking to you. and learning from you and hopefully giving you some information that's useful. So that's it for today. And post your comments, whether or not this was useful or not, whether or not I should continue doing these things if they're helpful. And for those of you who are catching this on the rebroadcast, please post your comments and ask questions and engage, because that's the way that we learn from this group. And I will see you all next time. Take care.